And then the question becomes not why is the internet insecure, but why are our endpoints so insecure? Why are our operating systems so insecure? Why are our computers so insecure? And so that's what I investigated. Why was Unix, which was the operating system used at the time on the internet, why was it so insecure? And here comes the upcode explanation, which is that the Unix was created for researchers to share their stuff, not to prevent people from stealing it. So I think the story of the Morris worm, not only I think is a kind of an engaging story about like a kid who accidentally crashes the internet, but also the story of what's the design principle of the internet and what kinds of cultural practices led to the creation of insecure endpoints.
I'm Jack Goldsmith, and this is the Lawfare podcast, May 23rd, 2023. Hacking and cybersecurity are evergreen issues in the news and on Lawfare. Scott Shapiro, a professor of law and philosophy at Yale University, has a new book on how and why hacking works and what to do about it. It's called Fancy Bear Goes Phishing, The Dark History of the Information Age in 5 Extraordinary Hacks. Scott and I talk about how his pre-law professor obsession with computers, combined with his recent work in international law, led him to write the book. And we discuss the lessons that the 5 hacks discussed in the book teach, including the limits of technology in solving cybersecurity problems, the importance of the human dimension to cybersecurity, and why we shouldn't be panicked about the state of cyber insecurity. It's the Lawfare podcast, May 23rd, The Dark History of the Information Age. Scott, you're a professor at Yale Law School with a PhD in philosophy, and you're best known for your work in jurisprudence. So my first question is, what qualifies you to write a book on hacking and cybersecurity?
Yeah, indeed, what does qualify me to write this book? Well, so like so many young boys growing up in the 70s and 80s, I became obsessed with personal computers. My parents got me an Apple II, and I just got really into coding. And then I was a declared computer science major in college, and I had my own small computer company. And I published in theoretical computer science. And then I just stopped right before the web came out in the early 1990s. And I got a PhD in philosophy and got a law degree. And I just kind of gave it up. But I had a lot of this background from my earlier education. And so when I finished writing a book with our friend, my colleague, Ona Hathaway, on war, people were asking, well, what about cyber war? And I thought, well, I could figure this out because I know how operating systems work and I know how to program and assembly, yada, yada, yada. And then I found out that actually it was really hard to learn how to do it. So I immersed myself for several years learning how to hack and learning about cybersecurity and doing deep research in it. And what I found fascinating is that on the one hand, there's so much information out there on it. On the other hand, it's very, very hard to understand all that information. So I thought, well, maybe I would write a book that would help people understand what's going on and kind of take them along the journey that I had, going from knowing about computers to kind of basic stuff about computers, but then learning how hacking works. And it was really fun, but also very hard. And I wrote up the book. I thought other people might enjoy learning about it.
Well, I certainly enjoyed learning about it. I know a decent amount about cybersecurity, and I learned and hacking, at least in some areas. And I learned a ton from the book. And it must have been very hard to write because it's unbelievably accessible. I mean, this is a book that gets into technical and philosophical issues. It explains some technical sides of hacking that are extremely accessible. The philosophical discussions are interesting, but the whole thing is told through 5 stories. The title of the book, the subtitle of the book is The Dark History of the Information Age in 5 Extraordinary Hacks. So you tell these stories to answer three questions, and you say this up front in the book. One, why is the internet so insecure? Two, how do hackers do what they do? And three, what can be done? And I guess the stories are designed to answer the first two questions. Why is the internet so insecure? And how do hackers do what they do? So I want to walk through some of the stories, but before we do that, I just want to get a basic distinction out on the table. I think one of the most important distinctions that runs throughout the book, and that's the distinction between down code and up code. Would you explain what that means?
Yeah, sure. So down code is the word that I use for anything that's below your fingertips, code-wise. So it's your operating system, your application programs you're using, network protocols, what's going on in your router, all the stuff below your fingertips. That's down code, the technical computer code. Up code is anything above your fingertips. So psychological habits, social norms, legal norms, industrial standards, website terms of service, all the kind of norm stuff that you and I talk about in our day jobs. That's what I call up code. And what I try to show through the stories is that you can explain hacking through down code, and that's what I try to do. I try to explain how do buffer overflows work, how does SQL injections work, but more importantly, how did we get to the point where these attacks work? In other words, what kinds of incentives are out there that influence developers to create insecure code and then influence users to be tricked into divulging their information? And so the idea is that up code shapes down code. That is the reason why we have the technical vulnerabilities that we have is in large part because of the political or human vulnerabilities in the up code. And so by telling the stories of these human beings who kind of get into these sticky situations, on the one hand, I was trying to make it a readable experience, and I wanted to explain how things happened organically, but I also wanted to kind of show people that these hacks arise because human beings are acting in certain ways, responding to certain legal norms, certain social norms, certain types of cultural expectations that lead them into engaging in criminal activity. And so in trying to humanize hackers, I was trying to show the human dimensions and where we might intervene in the up code to create better down code.
Okay, so you play out that thesis and do much more through 5 stories. Let's start with the first one. This is the story of the famous Morris worm. This story has been told before, but you tell it in a new, engaging way. But many of our listeners might not even know what the Morris worm is. So can you just remind us?
Yeah, sure. So the Morris worm is considered the first kind of major internet hack. On November 2nd, 1988, a graduate student, first-year graduate student at Cornell, Robert Morris Jr., he released a worm that is like a self-replicating computer program, in part as a science experiment. He wanted to see how essentially big the internet was, but he accidentally crashed it. And it was like a major news story when it happened. It was actually the first time that the media ever used the word internet, which is amazing. And Robert Morris was indicted, tried, and ultimately convicted of violating the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. And I think it was a shock to the computer science community that a graduate student could take down the internet, which is scary not only from a research perspective. It would just mess up the research network that was created, but it also people worried about the military implications. Would somebody be able to set off a nuclear war through hacking? So it was a very big deal. And in the book, I think what I tried to address by telling the story, and one of the things that I think is new about the way I tell the story is that nobody has had, as far as I know, nobody has had a copy of the trial transcripts. So I was able to, at the Yale Law Library, went to Syracuse and copied all of it, so all 2,000 pages. And so I got to read the entire trial record and learn about exactly what had happened, both factually, but also legally. And one of the questions I was really interested in is like, how could this happen? Why is the first question that I talk about in the book? Why is the internet so insecure that a grad student could crash it? And the argument I try to make is that in a way that's the wrong question. The question should not be, why is the internet insecure that a graduate student could crash it? Because I think people don't understand that the way in which the internet was designed, it was designed so to follow what's sometimes called the end-to-end principle. The idea is that you put all the intelligence at the end, at the computers, the phones, whatever, and you make the inside of the internet pretty rudimentary. The point of the internet is supposed to be to transmit information. And what the Morris worm showed was the internet was working exactly as it was supposed to. It was taking things from one end to another. The problem is that the endpoints were so insecure. And then the question becomes not why is the internet insecure, but why are our endpoints so insecure? Why are our operating systems so insecure? Why are our computers so insecure? And so that's what I investigated. Why was Unix, which was the operating system used at the time on the internet, why was it so insecure? And here comes the upcode explanation, which is that the Unix was created for researchers to share their stuff, not to prevent people from stealing it. So I think the story of the Morris worm, not only I think is a kind of an engaging story about like a kid who accidentally crashes the internet, but also the story of what's the design principle of the internet and what kinds of cultural practices led to the creation of insecure endpoints.
So let me ask you about that. I understand, and it's well known that the internet wasn't built with security in mind. It wasn't designed with security in mind. But what exactly, it wasn't quite clear on what exactly the state of the world was in terms of concern about cybersecurity when this happened. I mean, was there widespread concern that this growing mechanism, or whatever you want to call it, would be able to be used for ends other than maybe negative ends or ends other than research, and that it was vulnerable to hacking? So what was the kind of state of understanding about cybersecurity at the time of the hack? And how shocking was this, or was it to be expected?
So the first conference on cybersecurity was in 1967. So even before the first links in the internet, the ARPANET, were created. As computers became multi-user systems and more than one person could use the computer at the same time, people started to worry, well, like, would one user be able to get the information of another user? The big cultural event that put cybersecurity on the map was the movie War Games, which tells the story of a teenager in his room who is what is now called war dialing, that is randomly dialing numbers over a modem to try to see if he can get a connection, and gets a connection to what he thinks is a video game repository, but it turns out to be a NORAD computer, and almost starts a nuclear war. And Ronald Reagan saw this at the White House and then got very concerned as did many members of Congress. And this becomes the origins of the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, which makes it a federal crime for the first time to hack certain types of computers. So the idea of cyber insecurity is bubbling up in the 1980s, but I don't think that people even knew that there was this thing called the internet. I was a computer science major in the 1980s, and I had never heard the word internet. I didn't even know that there was an internet. I knew I could get information from other computers, but I didn't know anything really about it. So I think the Morris worm was a shock to everyone, even though the country was primed through war games to be concerned with this.
How much do you think it was a shock to his father? Tell us who he was.
Oh, my Lord. So this is like every father's and son's nightmare. So Robert Morris Jr. is the son of Robert Morris Sr., Bob Morris, who is a mathematical cryptographer who works at Bell Labs. Amazingly, my father and his father worked in the same place, although I don't think they knew each other. My father was an electrical engineer working at Bell Labs. But it turns out, and this is so painful to every time I think about it, but his father, Bob Morris, had left Bell Labs and had become the chief scientist for the National Security Agency. So when the Morris worm hit the newspapers and the news, Robert Morris Jr. had to call his dad, the head scientist for cybersecurity at the NSA, and say, "Dad, I just crashed the internet. I'm the person who did it." And that must have been extraordinarily difficult for the family. And my heart goes out to them. And that must have been a terrible experience.
It must have been an interesting time inside the NSA to have those conversations.
Oh my God! I mean, at the time, Bob Morris was trying to get a promotion. Moving out, he loved the NSA because that was like the repository of all the cryptographical secrets. And he was a cryptographer, and then he had to leave. It was just, not he had to leave, but like it really stalled his career. So it was not a good situation. Not a good situation.
Okay, second story is Paris Hilton's nude photos.
Right. So in the book, so just say there were five hacks. The second one is the Bulgarian virus factory. This is a story about how the hotbed in the world, the global hot zone for computer viruses was Bulgaria in the early 1990s. And so I talk about the Bulgarian virus factory in that scene and what viruses are, yada, yada, yada.
Well, let me just actually ask you a question about that. Could you just give us a thumbnail account of, you have a really interesting discussion in those chapters of kind of the psychology of the young hacker. Can you just kind of summarize the learning on that?
Yeah, so it turns out to be the case that certain stereotypes about hackers are true, which is that they tend to be almost all young men. They tend to get into hacking through gaming culture, at least in the West. And contrary to the stereotype that they're loners, they're in fact incredibly social. But they're social online, and peer pressure and status and being an elite hacker plays an enormous role in why these hackers do what they do and how they escalate. And in a way, what we would say nowadays, they were chasing clout. They were trying to be considered like really excellent hackers and players at this game, and things kind of get out of hand. And it's amazing how many hackers, how that actually encapsulates the case histories of so many of these hackers. And it's a little different in Eastern Europe and other less developed tech economies. There, hackers, it's less about trying to be elite and more about trying to make money on the side. So the Bulgarian virus factory story kind of got into the psychology, like who would write a virus and release it? Like, it just seems like such a malicious thing to do, and it's the kind of malicious, stupid things that young boys do.
And also, first of all, I was surprised that seems to be a robust literature about this, but also when they're pressed on it, when they finally get caught, it seemed like there were several examples of them kind of not having a realistic understanding of the impact of their actions in the real world. Is that fair?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's why Twitter is the way it is, and why the internet is the way it is that as Mike Tyson said, the social media made it such that you can insult somebody without getting punched in the face. And part of it is that, like, how are they gonna hurt you? But I think more importantly is that it doesn't feel real to them. It's happening to some nameless, faceless person over the internet. They're just doing it for the lulz. As Sarah Gordon, who did so much work in the mid 90s to try to figure out who these kids were. As she said, the problem is that they never saw somebody cry because they lost their thesis. If they did, they might reconsider their actions. So it's just a story of, like, the difficulties that human beings have dealing online without seeing somebody that you're hurting visually and hearing them cry.
Okay, now let's go to Paris Hilton's nude photos.
Yeah, because I mean, in a way, this is a continuation of that story. So in 2005, big news: Paris Hilton, the it girl of that decade, has her cell phone hacked, and nude photos leaked onto the internet. And the big question is, how did it happen? How could somebody hack her cell phone? You remember, Paris Hilton, is obviously a celebrity. She's surrounded all the time. How's a hacker gonna get to her cell phone? And what's fascinating is that the stories that I tell in the book is always like hackers are kind of taking advantage of the next wave in development of the internet or in computer technology before everyone else catches on. And so what people didn't realize in 2005 was that there was this thing called the cloud, that our phones would be uploading and downloading, being constantly in sync with these remote servers somewhere, and that your pictures, your data are not going to just be on your phone, but going to be in the cloud, and then it's going to be accessible by the web. And so there are all these theories as to how her cell phone could have been hacked. The New York Times ran a front page story, I believe, on how she got hacked, saying that it might have been Bluetooth. It might have hacked Bluetooth. Now, the only problem is that her cell phone, the Sidekick 2, didn't have Bluetooth. Another claim was that people guessed her security question. So what's the name of her pet Chihuahua, which was Tinkerbell? So what I did was I found the person who was ultimately convicted of the hack, a 16-year-old boy called Cameron LaCroix, and he has spent many years in jail for various types of recidivism for hacking. And I was able to track him down and to learn about how exactly he was able to hack her phone. And I won't spoil it for people. But it was 2 weeks before the book was going to press. Like, I couldn't change it anymore. I finally got in touch with him, and he told me the story. And so it's a really interesting story. He's now 32, and he's really kind of changed his life. He seems to have aged out, as they say, of virus writing. And I wish him luck building his life back, because I do think he feels very regretful that he had done what he had done. He apologized on national television to Paris Hilton at the time, and so I tell his story.
So I think it was in these chapters where, and I didn't fully appreciate this, you talked about how Bill Gates, is Microsoft CEO at the time, I guess, founder Bill Gates' slow reaction to the importance of the internet, and then his aggressive reaction to the threat that the internet posed to his business model, how those two impulses were really responsible for a lot of the insecurity in the network. Is that fair?
I think so. I think, I blame Bill Gates a lot in the book. I think that is entirely appropriate. The story that I tell and has often been told is that Microsoft missed, at least initially, the internet revolution when Michael Andreessen is building Mosaic, which becomes Netscape, and Silicon Valley becomes internet crazy. Microsoft and Bill Gates are focusing on Windows 95. They want to maintain and extend their iron grip on the operating system so that basically computers of the world need to run Windows. And so they're so focused on Windows that they miss this new thing, the internet. And when they have to, after Windows 95 comes out, they realize they have to play catch up, but they're pretty behind. And so Bill Gates sends down an edict, which is, we are going to webify everything. We are going to connect everything to the web. Now, if you take like an operating system like Windows that had been developed from DOS, from Disk Operating System, which was a single-use computer operating system, and then you develop and had no security features, and you develop a new product from that, and you're not thinking about security, and then all of a sudden you connect it to a global network of networks, you're going to get a disaster. And that is what the story of the late 1990s and the early 2000s is. If you ever, I'm not sure, maybe you remember, but the blue screen of death, the Windows crashed all the time. It was just terrible. People think about security as just about people stealing your stuff, but security is also about making sure your computer works. And it was just always crashing through various types of malware or bad drivers, or just this relentless movement to capture as much market share as they could, or hold on to as much market share as they could, which just creates a nightmare. And the only thing that turns it around is 9/11. 9/11 all of a sudden acts as like a security shock to everyone. Now is all of a sudden interested in security. And then they learn that, wow, a lot of things are connected to the internet, and they're running Microsoft, and it's a really insecure operating system. Something needs to be done. Linux becomes commercialized at the time. There's Apple comes back on the scene. So there's now pressure. People are breathing down Microsoft's neck, saying Microsoft is, if you don't want your computer always to crash, use a different operating system. So they're scared because they went too far. The really nice story, I think, is that people think that Microsoft really changed their, what I would call their corporate upcode. That is, they really changed how they think about software development. This is sometimes called secure software development. Like, how do you build systems from the outset that are secure? And I think they've done an absolutely wonderful job My Windows rarely crashes. Anti-malware software is really well integrated with Windows. So it's a real story of a turnaround, and it's an upcode turnaround. It's a change in corporate values.
But it's a change in corporate values that I assume was driven by business needs because, I mean, the products were so unreliable and buggy. I mean, wasn't that part of the reason why they switched?
Oh, absolutely right. So lots of times we create new norms that are good for not the most noble of reasons. Absolutely. I think partly Bill Gates was worried that they were getting so many client complaints that their product, they're worried it was going to lose its competitiveness. But I also think that, post 9/11, I think, as Americans, we started worrying about security as like a real thing. And I don't want to, I mean, I can't jump into Bill Gates's mind, but I would imagine that, some sense of like, well, actually, this is now a national security threat. And, as an American, I should do something about it. As a human being, I should do something about it. I think that probably motivated him to some extent as well.
Okay, let's move on to the story that gave the book its name, The Hack of the Democratic National Committee. And I'll let you explain why that gave the book its name.
Oh yeah, so the book's called Fancy Bear Goes Phishing. Fancy Bear is the name of one of the hacking units of the GRU, Russian military intelligence. And as I'm sure many people that listen to Lawfare remember that Fancy Bear hacked the DNC in March, April of 2016. It was also the case that roughly a year earlier, another Russian hacking unit, codenamed Cozy Bear, had also infiltrated the Democratic National Committee's computer network. So you had two Russian intelligence units somewhat competitively in the same DNC networks. And at least Fancy Bear got into the network through phishing.
You should explain that that's PH, not F.
Oh, right. Yes. It's the computer phishing. So, as we all know, phishing is like a deceptive email designed to have somebody elicit sensitive information, which can be used to compromise their computer security. And we have a lot of the phishing emails from Fancy Bear, and I was able to analyze those phishing emails to show why they were very well designed phishing emails. But I think the main question I was really interested in in talking about this hack, which was like, how could it have happened? So the FBI knows a year ahead of time. Well, let's see. They know from September, at least from September 2015, maybe earlier, probably earlier, several months earlier, that Russia has infiltrated the DNC. This is the Cozy Bear intrusion. And it takes 6 months for the FBI to have a conversation with the DNC. So, why does it take so long for the FBI to get in touch with the DNC, and why the DNC, when they get feelers out from the FBI, why don't they respond right away? I mean, it seems like a 4-alarm fire. The Russians are in our network. The Russians are in our network. So I was really interested to try to figure this out.
I mean, for me, this is the best example of. It's the most powerful example in the book of an upcode failure.
Oh yeah. So yeah, thanks. So in a way, what happens is that the FBI, as Americans, we kind of don't, I mean, you do, and maybe many listeners to Lawfare podcast know this, but the FBI is this hybrid organization. It's a combination of a counterintelligence organization and a law enforcement organization. And they both exist in the same organization with, some separations between the two, obviously. And from an intelligence perspective, the fact that the Russians were targeting the Democratic National Committee was completely unremarkable. I mean, this may shock you, Jack, but states hack other states. Even America hacks other states.
We learned this from Mr. Snowden.
We learned this from Mr. Snowden, but I also
we knew it before then, but we really saw the documents with Mr. Snowden.
Right. So we know what we learned from Snowden is just the amazing reach of the NSA and other members of the intelligence community. But the idea that Russia is targeting the DNC is that they're targeting everyone. They're targeting Brookings. They're targeting political science departments. They're going after as many targets as they can, in part because they ran out of hard targets. In 2012 and 2013, there's this effort to infiltrate the NSA, the Pentagon, the Joint Chiefs. And they're just kind of widening their circle. And the fact that Russia is targeting the DNC is like, okay, dog bites man, news at 11. It's just not news. So on the one hand, the FBI is doing like courtesy calls to different political organizations, like the Russians are targeting you. Let me go down to the next one on my list. So one thing is that this is completely unremarkable from an international relations perspective. Under international law, in fact, espionage for national security reasons is actually legal. Now, why doesn't the DNC respond? Well, because the DNC is not that surprised that the Russians are targeting them. But more importantly, they're worried that this is a part of the Hillary email investigation. They think this is not counterintelligence. They think that, this could be the law enforcement side. In fact, the law enforcement side did reach out in this case. So they're not that anxious to talk to the FBI either. And one of the things that's amazing is that FBI prosecutors are not allowed to lie, but FBI agents are. So the DNC doesn't want to talk to the FBI. The FBI is not in a huge rush to talk to the DNC. And in a way, people are acting rationally given the upcode, but it kind of leads to a disaster.
Yeah, I mean, that's the amazing thing is that the Russians were in the network. The FBI knew it. The DNC knew it, that someone was in the network. But they were all blasé about it, as you show in wonderful detail. And yet they just didn't contemplate the enormous damage that could be done. It just wasn't on the radar screen, it seemed.
Right, because let me use the word again. Global upcode stated that you are allowed to steal information from, if you're a state, you can steal information related to national security from another state, but keep it to yourself. I mean, this is espionage.
But even doxing was not new then. I mean, there are examples in international relations going back a long ways of one country stealing information from another and then publishing it or publishing some version of it to try to affect international relations. But again, for all the reasons you're saying and more that you talk about in the book, it just wasn't imagined.
Yeah, it wasn't. Yeah, I mean, it was an understandable failure of imagination, I would say. But if you kind of think about it from the perspective of the intelligence community, you could see how it could happen, though it was obviously a failure and a big failure. And so, what to make of it? I think, the FBI probably needs to manage its, the relationships between its intelligence side and its criminal side in a different way when it comes to political campaigns, which, of course, we're still dealing with the fallout from 2016 and this problem, and whether Section 702 of FISA gets re-upped is very much implicated in this.
Yeah. So I'm going to skip over the last story about the Mirai botnet. I think that's how you pronounce it. Is that right?
Yeah. Yes.
I want to skip over that. It's a great story, but I want to get to some bigger themes in the book, and it follows right from what you just said. So the DNC hack was a huge deal, and it was, by any measure, hugely successful from the Russian perspective and hugely damaging to the United States. And all of the hacks you talk about were in some sense big deals. And yet one big theme of the book, and you state this right up front, is that you're not panicking, that you're against alarmism in this area. Can you explain why?
Yeah, so I think so. I don't want to be a Pollyanna about it. Obviously, hacking exists, cybercrime exists, cyber espionage exists, cyber war may or may not be a thing. But I think that there's this sense that many people have when they read about hacking is that since there's security vulnerabilities in code everywhere, and that since there are these nameless faceless hackers all around the world, and since so many stories of hacking are in the news, they worry that they're obviously going to be hacked because everyone's getting hacked. And one of the things I try to get across in the book is, just because you can be hacked doesn't mean you will be hacked, for the simple reason that you don't have what most cyber criminals want. They don't really care. They don't really want to spy on you when you make dinner. They're trying to make money. They're trying to pick off people who make it really, really easy to hack them. And what I try to tell people is, we can get so overwhelmed by all the security advice that we're constantly be given. Don't reuse passwords. Have your passwords 12 letters long. Immediately, use a VPN. Whatever people say. Largely, you'll be safe if you just don't do stupid things like clicking on links from people that you don't know, or just refusing to update your operating system no matter what. If you make it a little bit harder for cyber criminals to get you, then it won't be worth their effort to, because it'll take them more time and more money to get you than it's worth. So that's one thing I just want to tell people, like, just don't do the reckless things. And you don't have to have like 37 special characters in your password. You should really use two-factor authentication. It's a little bit of a pain in the ass, but it's unbelievably good technology. People say, oh, if you use two-factor authentication, you should not use a text, SMS. Yeah, you shouldn't do that. You should use something like Duo. But it's so much better than not having two-factor authentication. So I think that the kind of part of the alarmism I want to combat is that you don't have to be bulletproof. You just have to be a little bit better than the next guy to be vulnerable and to get hacked. Mistakes happen, accidents happen. You can get unlucky. Happens all the time. So therefore you should have backups. But, other than that, live your life.
Okay. And yet you think we can do a lot better. And your advice, first of all, you're against solutionism. I want you to explain what that means. And then we'll talk about what your anti-solutionist solutions are.
Right. So solutionism is the term that was coined by the social critic Evgeny Morozov to describe this sense that, it's very, very rampant in America nowadays, certainly a Silicon Valley ideology, at least in part, that the way to solve social problems is through technology. Always think about how can we create or deploy or adapt technology to solve the social problem. Climate change, what's technology? Cybersecurity, what technology can we use? So solutionism in cybersecurity would say we have to get rid of as many vulnerabilities in the down code as possible. And we should be using as much, protective technology as possible. And what I try to get across is the idea that when you think about technology, you have to realize that like human beings made it. And they're following incentives, many, many kinds of incentives, legal incentives, social incentives, personal habits, personal ethics. There are so many reasons why people get up in the morning, go to their job.
Financial incentives.
Right. And of course, financial incentives. They get up, they go to work, and they go home, and the down code, so to speak, is the result of that. It's the result of a long chain of incentives and norms which impose these incentives. And so the thought is that once you get to the down code, you're already at the end of the chain, and it's in some sense is kind of too late. You have to fix something that you might have been able to forestall by just changing the incentives that coders had in the first place. So, people often talk when they talk about down code about the stack. So you have like a set of code that all kind of interlocks. So you have your operating system, and then you have your application, and then you have your graphical user interface. So you have these layers of down code. And I want to say we have layers of up code. We have all these kinds of rules, which then bottoms out in the creation of down code. And when I speak, I'm a lawyer, as of course you are. And what I want to say is that lawyers are coders, but they're up coders. And we're good at figuring out how to adjust, develop, tweak rules that will create different kinds of incentives. And so what I want us to focus on is making the rule such that the code that we have is much more secure. So we don't even have to say to the user, make sure not to be so reckless. Let's make it easier for people to be secure, even though ultimately they have to bear some responsibility in making sure they don't do stupid things.
Okay, so I have a couple of questions about that. The first one is, just to make sure I understand, you say somewhere in the book that, and this is basically what you just said, that solving problems in the up code stack can fix or counteract problems in the down code. And that's a lot of what the book is about, is showing that a lot of these cybersecurity problems are what you call up code, the incentives for and foibles and psychological defects in human reasoning and behavior and organization. But it runs both ways, doesn't it? I mean, you gave the example of two-factor authentication. That's a down code solution, or at least partially. And isn't it always a back and forth? Don't we always have to go and prove one or the other? And it's not the case that either one of them is a silver bullet.
Right. Yeah. So let me just say, I don't make the claim, or at least I hope I don't make the claim, because it's false, that upcode can get rid of all the vulnerabilities.
No. I wasn't suggesting that. But explain the relationship a little bit more, because there are downcode solutions to
absolutely. Right. So I'm not against using anti-malware software. I really hope you do that, and all these other things. Take two-factor authentication. Two-factor authentication has been around for a while, but the DNC didn't use it. If the DNC had used two-factor authentication, the phishing attacks most likely would not have worked. They did not work against Hillary's campaign, Hillary for America, because they did use two-factor authentication there. So the fact that the technology exists doesn't actually mean that anyone's going to use it. The way it gets used is let's say at Yale, for example, my university, I have to use two-factor authentication, or else I can't get into a lot of my information remotely. This was a decision made by the university that security required this form of inconvenience. So the technology itself is one thing, but there needs to be rules which require people to use these things. That's the first thing. The second thing I want to say is that, of course, there is a feedback loop between upcode and downcode. So the upcode shapes the downcode. That is, the incentives shape what kind of code gets developed by engineers. But then the creation of new technologies force us to think newly about normative problems. So just think about social media and content moderation. How should private companies deal with speech on the internet? What is the responsibility, the duties of private companies like Twitter and Facebook to police the speech on their platforms? This is an upcode question, which generates we even have a court-like thing, the Facebook Oversight Board, that it kind of is adjudicating upcode questions, developing it in a certain direction. So now we have new upcode in response to this technology that we didn't have before. So it is a kind of a feedback loop. But ultimately, what I want people to do is not always think, what's the technical fix? I'd like them to think, how did this happen? Why did this happen? What are the institutional, cultural, social, psychological, legal reasons that led to this, maybe disaster? And is there a way to tweak it, change it, maybe radically overhaul it? And this is a difficult normative question.
So that's a wonderful statement of kind of the core claim and argument of the book. And let me just build on that by asking you what I think is a hard question of, how do we ever know that we need more cybersecurity? The internet, you talk a lot in the book about various trade-offs between upcode and downcode, and there are trade-offs for having more cybersecurity. You talked about in the book about software liability and the reasons, the legal hurdles to it. A well-known objection to imposing software liability is that it would harm innovation or deter innovation on some dimension. The internet has flourished. The computer world has flourished. The digital world has flourished, and our lives have been enormously enriched by it. And the cybersecurity problems that we suffer through may just be the optimal cost, and maybe we're in the optimal situation now. How do we ever know for the benefits we've received? How do you know in any particular case that we need greater cybersecurity and that the costs of that maybe fixing the upcode or improving the upcode are worth it?
Yeah, that's such a fair and important question. And I think I have to say, I don't know that we're not at the optimal place. And this is a question about every subject matter that gets regulated, this question, and it needs to be asked and it needs to be addressed. So let me try to address it as best I can. So the first thing is to say, we're both law professors. Like in a way, so much of our day is consumed with reading about situations where some rule, some norm does not force a person or an organization to internalize their costs. Polluters, dumping stuff into the river, things like that. And one of the things that I think we know about that is that if you don't force people to internalize their costs, they generally won't. And that's almost guaranteed when we're talking about a business, that they're not going to internalize their costs. So the first thing is that there's a reason to think that if you don't force people to internalize their costs, they'll externalize their costs onto all of us. That's the first thing. The second thing is the history of security. The story I try to tell in the book is like problems happening because there's no liability, there's no penalty, there's no consequence, there's no cost to producing bad code. And we get the blue screen of death. We get rampant hacking. I don't think people, I mean, I'm sure you remember, but it was, I used to call IT like almost every other day to get rid of a virus on my computer. So we kind of know that, security vulnerabilities are going to proliferate if there's no internalization. And when there is internalization, like after 9/11, all of a sudden things got really, really better. And finally, how do we know that ultimately things got better from security, but we've choked off innovation? It doesn't seem like we've choked off innovation. There's still an enormous amount of innovation going on. We have historical examples of industries which were economically extremely important to the United States, where the innovation argument was made. And then finally, like in the case with the car in the late 1960s, when public attention was focused on highway safety, Congress got into the act. Automobiles were regulated, safety belts were mandated, yada, 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 and highway safety greatly increased. Ultimately, I think we need to experiment. We need to test. We need to methodically engage in normative experimentation. That's why I'm a little bit against the AI call for AI regulation right now. I think it's just a little too early to know what to do with it. So it's not like I love regulation. I just think that after, let's see, the internet's been around for roughly 50 years. I think we know enough to start doing things.
Okay, you mentioned AI, so let me ask the last question about that. There's a lot of speculation, at least that I've read, that artificial intelligence systems are going to make computers and computer systems more vulnerable in various ways, including by empowering bad actors to be better able to exploit upcode. And a good example is phishing attacks. At least I've read that these AI systems are going to allow targeted, convincing phishing attacks in a way that's not like anything that's going on now. So do you have a view about how AI affects the problems of your book?
Yeah, so I would say one of the main points I try to make in the book is that all security tools are dual use. That is, they can be used for good, they can be used for evil, they can be used for offense, it can be used for defense. So let's take encryption. Everyone loves encryption because it really reliably keeps communications secret when implemented correctly. So we love it when it's called encryption, we hate it when it's called ransomware. And so where somebody encrypts your data and then requires you to pay money in order to decrypt it. So that's an example of security tool which is supposed to make us more secure, which makes us more insecure. So when people are now all of a sudden extremely anxious about AI and how it's going to be used offensively, I think that they miss the fact that AI, and in particular the machine learning form that is so popular now. This has been, maybe 10 years at least been commercially deployed in commercial systems. Like when I go to these hacking conventions, I spend a lot of time walking and talking to vendors, and they all say the same thing, AI, 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 and this is before ChatGPT. So, the technology gets better for attackers, but it also gets better for defenders. And I think there's no question one of the biggest barriers to hacking for people who are, let's say, in Eastern Europe is the language barrier. And of course, ChatGPT and these chatbots are unbelievably good at having people overcome whatever linguistic difficulties they have about speaking competently in a particular language. But there's AI generation tools out there. So you could, figure out, well, does this look like it was created by a large language model? So I suspect that what will happen is that, that phishing will get automated and it will be AI powered. And then our email clients will use, as part of their spam filters, more sophisticated AI generation detection engines. And the cat and mouse game won't end there. So that's my take, is that yes, of course, we're going to see definitely more sophisticated attacks, and probably phishing is going to be the main vector. But we'll also probably see more sophisticated defensive technologies come online soon, and the circle of life will continue.
Scott Shapiro, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jack. It's always an incredible pleasure talking to you.
The Lawfare podcast is produced in cooperation with the Brookings Institution. You can get ad-free versions of this and other Lawfare podcasts by becoming a Lawfare material supporter at patreon.com/Lawfare. You'll also get access to special events and other content available only to our supporters. Please rate and review us wherever you get your podcasts. Look out for our other podcasts, including Rational Security, Chatter, Allies, and The Aftermath, our latest Lawfare Presents podcast series on the government's response to January 6th. And of course, check out our written work at lawfareblog.com. The podcast is edited by Jen Patia Howell, and your audio engineer this episode was Kara Schillen of Goat Rodeo. Our music is performed by Sophia Yan. As always, thank you for listening.